Hello, and you are very welcome to Cut Through the Noise. Cut Through the Noise is the podcast that helps business leaders increase sales through elevated communications and marketing. I'm your host, Aisling O'Rourke, and I am delighted to join you today. I am the founder of thecommunicationscoach.ie, a communications and media coaching company. We help business leaders speak with clarity, confidence, and of course, authenticity. In this series, season 10 of Cut Through the Noise, we're focusing in on artificial intelligence and whether it can be a friend or foe in marketing and communications terms. And I know there's an awful lot of people concerned that AI is going to steal our jobs, but I hope we've been able to show that actually it just proves how important the human touch is when it comes to our marketing in particular. At the end of the day, humans buy from humans, and that no algorithm will ever take that away, but it might help us be more efficient and really get the most out of our ideas and projects and messages in whatever shape or form that may take. But we do need to be conscious around safety and security when we are using these platforms, particularly because we are giving the AI, whichever brand it is you choose to use, so much information about our company and our workflow and even in some cases us personally. So that's why I'm particularly delighted to be joined by Elaine Burke of It's for Tech's Sake, the podcast all about technology, to talk us through security and the measures that we can put in place to make sure that we are using these AI platforms in as secure a way as we possibly can. I hope you enjoy our conversation. I'm delighted to be joined now by Elaine Burke of the For Tech's Sake podcast. Elaine, you're very welcome to Cut Through the Noise.
Thanks for having me.
So, Elaine, we've been talking in recent weeks on the podcast around AI and artificial intelligence and all, I suppose, the things to use it for and not to let it, get rid of the human touch and not let it think for us. But I think something that many of us, and I'm not saying I'm a saint in this regard because I know I'm not, but many of us have jumped headfirst into using all of these lovely new AI platforms and perhaps not thought about the information we're uploading and not really thought all that much about security when it comes to these particular platforms. And we've had cloud outages, we've had email account details being hacked and made public, we're hearing all of these things all the time. So when it comes to using any kind of AI platform and security, what do we need to think about first?
It's funny actually, because I did a podcast recently talking about your data legacy, so the kind of data trail that you leave behind you. And the researcher I spoke to in that found that the kind of things that people are sensitive about when it comes to their data aren't necessarily the things that are protected when it comes to data. And I do remember back in the day, there used to be an online joke of like a medical alert bracelet, but it had delete my internet history instead of a medical alert device on it. Because like when you think about it, your entire internet history, your search history could tell certain things about you that are things that you don't think of as being an open secret, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But that is information that you are sharing with Google, with your search provider, each time, and sometimes you're logged in on an account and that's attached to your account and that's part of your digital footprint. And as these tools are becoming something like a search tool for people, it can be for some people a first port of call where they go to with queries. It's again one of those things that it happens, they see it as a functional tool, but maybe aren't thinking of that data being collected, being gathered up under their profile and what that might become. And the thing about this particular chatbot functions is that the companies themselves are still even figuring out those long-term impacts, and also they're still figuring out the protections around them. There was instances not that long ago where people found that chats that they were having on these platforms, if they had created, say, a share link, that made it public, which meant it was also indexed by search engines. And once people discovered that, they were able to reverse engineer things and discover chats that people were having with chatbots through Google searches.
That was in relation to, I think, ChatGPT. And on the page, so if you're using on a desktop or a laptop, on the top right hand side of the page, there's this share function. And if you clicked that, and maybe I decide that I want Elaine to work in this particular thread with me in ChatGPT, I give Elaine this link to work on. But that was by clicking the share link, I was making that whole thread public and searchable by Google or
Yeah.
Internet Edge or whatever the Microsoft one is called nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. And only after the fact did they start working to correct that, to say, oh, we shouldn't be making these indexable. And then even since that problem, a new one has arisen where on the back end of websites, website providers can have access to the analytics, and that means that they can have access to typically the search terms that led someone to land on their website. But what has been happening more recently is that they're seeing lengthy reams of text coming up as what were normally search terms. And so again, that they were seeing chats with a chatbot that led to a visit to their website. And again, this shouldn't be coming up. This shouldn't become data that's accessible by this other third party in the cycle. And this is what I mean about, like, they're still actually, I don't think the evidence points to them having thought through all of these scenarios, and there's still a lot of teething problems with these services, and they're still figuring out the various data protection and safety requirements around them. As we're speaking, also the EU is looking at maybe making some changes to GDPR to open up the ability for these systems to be able to process even more data than they're currently allowed to. So we might have a conversation now that the context might change in. But generally speaking, people don't want to be sharing too much information too freely, too liberally with these systems. And the level of your protection will depend on what kind of platform and what kind of subscription you're on, even within one platform. It actually varies quite greatly. It tends to be that paid enterprise users have more protections over how their data will be used, or have access to settings that enable them more control over that. So maybe the defaults still have things pretty open, but you can get into the settings and change things. But the free to use chatbots, it tends to be, and it's not always the case, but it tends to be that they are, your free use is being paid for by your data. Essentially, we're kind of used to that idea of your data being the product if you're not paying for something.
Well, we are, but yet I don't know that people think about it enough, because, you might have, like, say we take like people who work in comms and marketing, like, they're all being encouraged and pushed towards using some kind of AI tool to create more content, to do it more efficiently. But maybe the line manager doesn't want to pay for that really expensive subscription as an ongoing cost. And sure, like, are you really getting better results from it? But actually, it's not about whether or not the results are any better. It's about, if you're paying for it, then you're no longer, in theory, the product, because if it's free, then you and your data is the product.
Also, yeah, like those professionals are likely working with clients on those projects. And what do your client confidentiality agreements say when it comes to this kind of thing? And have you accounted for that? And could there be repercussions if it's found out that you fed client data into one of these systems that was a free version of it, and that you didn't disclose that to a client, and that gave them a data vulnerability? And it has happened that companies have had to restrict access to these platforms because of employees kind of taking liberties in what they would input in there. A very famous example that's been reported on is at Samsung. They famously were restricting employees from accessing chatbots, gave them access, and then found that employees were putting intellectual property and proprietary information from the company into these chatbots to do their day-to-day work, to solve their day-to-day problems. And that meant that's essentially data leakage from that company, very, very sensitive data leakage, proprietary information. So they had to log things down again. So you do need to be aware that it's kind of like in anything with cybersecurity, that there's no such thing really as 100% secure, even when the terms of use and the agreements say that the platform is not going to use the material in training and is not sharing the information, is not storing the information. You still have to take that with a grain of salt, especially with these systems more so than other systems, simply because they are still in an experimental nascent phase. There's not a huge amount of clarity on how inputs get churned up into the model and spat back out again. It's called black box AI a lot of the time because stuff goes in, stuff comes out, no one's totally sure what happens in between. So you do have to be, if it's really, really highly sensitive information, using any kind of an open platform poses some element of risk. But at the very bare minimum, if you're trying to safely use those, you should be looking at the terms of service and making sure that if it's sensitive information, that it's not going to be shared, not going to be replicated, not going to be input into training data or anything like that.
And I think as well, like these platforms are evolving rapidly and how they work is changing and even how they look, the settings might move in different places, which is very annoying if you're using them on a daily basis and you've gotten used to using it in one particular way or another. Is it important then, Elaine, to go back in once a month or every week or a couple of weeks just to check the security settings to make sure that you have them set the way you want to? Because I know you're saying it's not 100%, but that at least you have turned on whatever protections are available depending on the plan that you're paying for.
Tends to be certainly when a major platform makes a change like that, that you will be notified. So you do have to pay attention to, say, email notifications or pop-ups when you first log in that say what's new. It might be like a new software update, but that includes information about changes that have been made there. Always worth paying attention to those. And yeah, I mean, doing regular audits is a great idea in practice, but will people do it? It's one thing that people sign up to say that they'll do and then won't do. But do pay attention to the changes. And if it comes to it and you are starting a new project and you're feeding in new information, there's no harm in double checking that you've made it as airtight as you can do within the system that you're working in. And if not, plenty of companies, what they'll do is they'll input files that they have redacted in some way. So they're files that they want to work with these systems, but to do it in a way that's safe and that doesn't breach any client confidentiality, they'll redact certain information. So the bones that they need to work with go into the machine, and then the meat on those bones that they don't need to be sharing, that can be blocked out in certain ways as well.
And then, of course, like, regardless of what policy might be in place in a particular business or a company, you will always have, like, say, for instance, if you say to your team, look, we're not allowed to use such and such an AI platform, we have to use this particular one. You'll always have people who will try and do it on their personal accounts. And I think if we as users decide to do that, then you have to remember that if anything goes wrong, the liability is with us as individuals and not with the company. And that's a huge security risk that I think is a little bit too easy to fall into the trap of making.
Yeah, and it's honestly not a new problem. Like it's this challenge of what's called shadow IT, which is like you will have rules for your IT environment as a business, as an organization, and how your team is supposed to work within that. But I mean, most competent IT leaders know that there's also IT behavior that takes place that they don't know about, that's not disclosed, and that's outside of the guidance and policy guidelines. It's the same with AI. There is, now it's called shadow AI, but it's just shadow IT all over again, just using a different technology. And I think that's happening quite a bit in the case where maybe people don't want to admit as well that
Yeah.
they're using AI tools. There is a sentiment around it that can be quite negative and disparaging if you are found to be using it, and that people maybe look down on it. So people might be using it to help them along and not willing to admit it. And if you have anything that where people are keeping it under the shadows and not disclosing it, that they are a risk for your system. And that's something that's well known in the IT and cybersecurity world, is that this happens, it exists. So you still have to make sure that the people that are in charge of your IT and your cybersecurity know that that's a reality, and they have to be prepared for potential breaches that might come that way. Mitigating that by making sure that your staff are well informed and well trained and are brought on the journey of why these policies are in place and why they're important to stick to. Like you shouldn't have to explain to people working with like sensitive health data about why you need to have a laptop that's heavily password protected, especially if you're going to be working off site with it and things like that. But it's something that you do have to do, because I think with flexible working, especially, people get used to the idea of being able to do everything on demand quite flexibly. And it's kind of the idea that you're sold with a lot of productivity software as well. But you do still have to work within the confines of your IT policy in order to be safe and secure, and also not liable for any kind of litigation for mistakes that you might have made.
Talk to me then about when we're setting up these accounts and like it doesn't really matter. And it's even with it's with software platforms, not just AI tools. They'll allow us sign up or log in to a platform using an email account, and that it's all, I'm trying not to say the particular email account in question, but that it's all like connected. So I don't need to remember, a gazillion passwords. Is that in itself though a security risk? If I have the one email account for my work that's linked to all the different platforms that I use?
Yeah, as long as that is secure. And the best way you can secure an account like that, where it is a primary account, it links to many different things. And for many people, that is linked to an email address. So your email is kind of like a hub for a lot of this stuff. It will be the way that you actually recover accounts when you lose access to them typically. And like you said, it's used possibly the same login through an authorization token to log into different services so that you don't have to generate new accounts and new passwords every time. I don't think there's anything wrong with that practice as long as you are practicing good security for that primary account. If you are, James Bond and you work with like super secure state secrets, like, yeah, maybe you want to have separate accounts for that. But for general day to day usage, even if it is for work, it's not the worst practice in the world. But that security side of it, that basic security hygiene means two-factor authentication or some form of multi-factor authentication, which means that it's not just a password that gives you access. It should be a password and something else, say a text sent to your phone is a fairly standard one, or even some kind of a biometric like a fingerprint scan. You want to have an extra layer so that because you kind of have to assume, again, there's no such thing as 100% security. So assume that it is also possible that your password gets breached and has been leaked online. So your recourse there is, okay, well, only the password alone won't get anyone into this account because they'll also need access to my phone or to my fingerprint or something like that as well. So those extra layers are really, really helpful. And if you have an account that's as important as our email accounts are to us these days, and we don't often think about this, you really want to be locking that one down. And then it's a good practice as well, if you have a primary email account that's very, very important, that for silly little things that you're setting up accounts for, maybe to get access to like a discount code or a Black Friday deal because we're at that time of year, have a junk email that you set up just for that. Like have a dud email address that you use for all those kind of fun and frivolities and things like that. That if that email got breached, there's absolutely nothing important connected to it. And then that can be for ease of use for navigating your fun stuff on the web, but then your serious stuff, you kind of take your security seriously on that side as well.
What about then, because I know you can use, and I'm not even sure the correct term of them, but these platforms that you can put all your passwords into and then lock them away. Like I'm thinking of the likes of LastPass. Now I know there's more brands than LastPass, just in case anybody gets annoyed, but those kind of, they're sold as a really security conscious way of doing things.
Yeah, these are password managers, and they're a really good idea for organizations as well, because something that can be challenging in organizations is managing permissions and access. And you're talking about like onboarding people and also removing people from accounts. Like that's something that can be easily missed in your process and then cause a gap in your cybersecurity defenses. So these kind of password managers can help solve a lot of those problems. They solve issues also of password sharing. Now, password sharing is not a best practice. Ideally, everyone should have their own account and their own access points that they've protected themselves. But again, being realistic, we know that teams share passwords. So password managers can help with that as well. And then for your personal usage, we all are creating so many passwords day to day. They do need to be securely created passwords, which means that they, don't often read easily or are human readable. So remembering all of that can be really, really hard. So they're a handy way to ensure that you are practicing good cyber hygiene, but it's not too taxing on your mental ability to try and remember all of these things. The way they work and the ones that you look for, you should look for ones that provide what's called zero knowledge architecture. So what that means is if I use a password manager and I have one super secure multi-factor authentication access point to get into my password manager, and that's the one that I have to remember myself because my password manager is not going to remember it for me, then I store other passwords in that it helps me to generate. The system itself is encrypted. So if they suffered a breach, they don't necessarily have knowledge of your passwords because they're all encrypted and only
Okay.
you at the end of the day should be able to access them. So zero knowledge architecture, that's what it's based on. Like the system stores and encrypts your data, so the system itself doesn't actually retain knowledge of your data without your approval and your access on the other end.
But yet it's the one place you can go to, and for that, that shopping account that you try to avoid using, but it's coming up to the festive season, so you might need to start using it. That's where the passwords and all that will be saved in there. You don't have to remember them, so it's definitely an option, and I know it's a paid for option in most cases. So it's something to consider. But back on the AI platforms, and when you're choosing one to set one up, and when you're going through the different settings, like you're going to see terms like memories and training and archive. How much attention do we need to pay to that in the settings, in terms of, because I think people are, like we said earlier, they're very concerned about how much information they're giving to these AI platforms, because like you say, it is black box tech. We don't really know what's going on there.
Yeah, and I also would say it looks like from the signals we're getting from them trying to also figure out a business model around this technology, because they're still trying to figure that aspect out, is that the route that they are likely to take to create a business model around this is through paid targeted advertising. So the same thing we've been getting all the time from these massive tech platforms that have huge adoption and a lot of free access is that the seemingly best way to make any money off of them is to sell your data to third party providers for advertising purposes. So that's why you see OpenAI launching a browser, because Google's monopoly on the ad tech market has certainly been helped along by it owning and operating the world's most popular web browser and the data that web browsing gives to them for that ad tech operation. The chats that you're having with chatbots can also be very, very useful and very revealing in terms of your purchasing habits, your the kind of things that influence you to make decisions.
Mhm.
Because if you're actually like having a chat with a chatbot to try and lead you towards making a decision, then it can infer a lot of things about what are the kind of nudges and pushes and things that I can use in e-commerce flows or even copywriting or in how things are presented to you to make you make purchases. So it'd be really, really valuable information. So yeah, you mentioned like the kind of terminology is things like memories and archive and things like that. And again, like these aren't kind of set in stone terms, so different platforms will use different kind of language around them. So you do need to be, paying attention to terms of use. No one likes reading them, and you don't have to read them to cover or anything like that, because a lot of the stuff is kind of boilerplate and standard. You want to be looking for the data practice elements of it and how data is shared, and you want to look for phrases like third party brokers and providers and things like that. And yeah, and you want to understand what is meant by things like memory and archive. Does archive store things just for you, or does it store things for the system as well to continue to use? The memory piece can be really useful for people if they want to come back to conversations, or if they want ongoing conversations to be able to remember a past conversation, if that's going to be useful for their interactions. So if you want that enabled, but you also still want some privacy, what are your abilities there? What can you limit the system in accessing? And there are tools out there where people can stand up their own large language models. If you have a good enough technical ability at home, you can download some code and run one of these yourselves. And then that's a really private way of creating a chatbot that you can be quite assured isn't going to be trading information with someone else. But more than likely, you're going to be using someone else's system.
Yeah.
So being familiar with their terminology, their terms of use, and their practices when it comes to data, and like their practices as a business, we can see this kind of in social media where people kind of paint the attitudes of the platforms that they interact with in the colors of the person who runs them in many ways. So you can kind of take that with these chatbots as well. Like they are going to have values that are aligned with the people that are in charge of them. So kind of pay attention to what they're saying as well and the kind of direction they want to take the business. And like I said, the signals for me from OpenAI is that they're going to take that business towards ad tech.
And of course, all of these entrepreneurs and CEOs, these companies, they're actually really public these days about their ambitions for their companies. They might be on like TikTok or X or whatever it is. So yeah, pay attention to what they're saying and how they're maybe responding to political controversies, or, it'll give you an insight into the values that they have. Elaine, we always like to keep a little bit of bonus content for our YouTube subscribers. So, if we accept that the majority of us at least have played with AI, if we're not using it day to day in our work, and a lot of people are using it in our day to day, it's like billions are using it in their day to day. When it comes to security, what is the top tip you can give us today?
Treat it like any kind of an online chat with a stranger. Do not share any sensitive information with it. And there's talk now of shifting things towards AI agents that can make purchases for you. I would probably hold off on giving a full license on doing that.
That's a very good point. Yes, because you wouldn't give a random person you met at the bus stop your credit card number, for example.
Exactly.
So perhaps don't give one that has the ability to go and spend money on your behalf without you knowing about it. Many parents have fallen into that trap where all of a sudden a child has spent €100 on a video game you didn't know existed on the phone. So it's something like that. Okay. So don't be giving out information to people as easily as we have done. And then it is looking at those data protection, and when you're comparing platforms and comparing pricing on those platforms, look at the level of protection over your data, because the platform itself might not feel all that different, but perhaps by paying a bit more, you might have more security.
Mhm. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. And one platform that can be quite interesting actually that I don't think comes up an awful lot when people are talking about the available tools out there, but it's one that I find quite useful and quite interesting is Google's Notebook LM, where you kind of are able to create what's called a retrieval augmented generation RAG. But what it means is that you'll have like these chatbots are underpinned by these massive large language models that enable them to have natural language conversations of quite wide and varying scope. That's kind of what underpins their ability to chat essentially. But when it comes to trying to limit the amount of information and access to it, Notebook LM will allow you to plug in certain documents into what's called a notebook. And then the questions that you engage with on the chatbot it's referencing the materials from those sources alone. So that's the retrieval augmented generation. You're augmenting the generation based on the documents that you are limiting it to accessing. Now, Notebook LM promises that it's not going to share your data and that it doesn't train on your data. But as I've already mentioned, there's no such thing as 100% proof on this. There's always some sort of vulnerability once you're sharing anything. So again, take that with a grain of salt. But it is something that you can do. And as I said as well, you can redact files before you put them in there if there's particularly sensitive information. And that can be useful, say, if you just want your staff to be able to query a lengthy policy document for reference to things or for answer to questions on things, and to do that with natural language processing. And my other reason for favoring Notebook LM and some of the other chatbots are going in this direction now, it will tell you where it sourced its information from.
Mm.
So you can click a link and it will pull up the part of even an audio file or the part of the document that it sourced its info from. So you can check back, and you should always check your sources with these things, definitely.
100%. And just as a final one on Notebook LLM, if anybody's listening, if you have maybe yourself or a member of your family has any kind of learning difficulty like dyslexia, you can upload maybe long and tedious PDFs that you don't really want to focus on reading the whole thing, and it will turn it into a podcast for you as well. So or similar to a podcast format, so you can listen to the PDF and get through it a little bit more easily if reading it in full is not your cup of tea. Well, Elaine Burke, if people want to find out more about you and what you do, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at It's Elaine Burke. I'm on Blue Sky, just Elaine Burke on Blue Sky. And then definitely check out the podcast. We're at For Tech's Sake Pod on all of the social media platforms, and you can find For Tech's Sake wherever you get your podcasts.
Elaine, thank you very much for joining us on Cut Through the Noise.
Thanks for having me.
And that was my chat with Elaine Burke of the It's for Tech's Sake podcast. I hope you enjoyed our chat today. At the end of the day, like we said, we do really need to take personal responsibility when we're using these platforms. Make sure that we're using them within the confines and the restraints put in place by perhaps the companies or the clients that we're working with, and that we're not needlessly giving away access to information, and that we are ensuring that those security protocols are switched on at all times. I hope you enjoyed listening to this week's episode of Cut Through the Noise. Thank you for listening and for tuning in from all around the world. I do really appreciate you helping us stay on the airwaves, as it were, over the past almost 2 years now with Cut Through the Noise. If you have been enjoying the podcast but have not yet hit that follow or subscribe button, please do so now. And please do give us a comment, give us a 5-star review, or even a full-on Apple podcast review. Anything you can do to help the podcast would be much appreciated. If I can be of any help to help you and your brand communicate with confidence, clarity, and authenticity, please feel free to get in contact with us at the Communications Coach HQ. You can email us on hello@thecommunicationscoach.ie, and we will be delighted to speak with you. Remember, we do live in a noisy world, so if you want to stand out from the sea of sameness, you have to speak authenticity, clarity, and confidence. And that will help you and your brand cut through the noise. Have a great week.